The Donkey Kong Bonanza Ask the Developer interviews have dropped this week, although this is the first chance I've had to record a video for it. This feature is one of my favourite things that Nintendo does, and this particular entry does not disappoint. As ever, I will read through the details and add a bit of commentary as we go, but let's start by checking out the group names, and we have what seems to be a relatively new group referenced in the list of credits, the Design Management Group, with whom Daisuke Watanabe is attached. I've talked actually in another long podcast that's going up on Patreon soon about the need to have specific departments to manage designs and such like across brands, and we've seen references to design management and sound management teams before, including on Tears of the Kingdom. But it's interesting to see this group referenced again, and at some point I will try to scope out what we can learn about their remit and how they interact with the other teams. Kento Motokura also isn't attached to a particular development group, which is usually a sign that he's more senior than the other people on the team, even though he is, of course, a long-time member of EPD Group 8, although I guess in theory now he could work with a new team outside EPD 8 as well as a senior producer. It seems that at this point he is to DK and to 3D Mario what Aonuma is to Zelda, which is a fairly meteoric rise by Nintendo standards. Okay then, let's start with meeting the team, and I'll move into quotes here. Kenta Motokura says, "Hello, I'm Kenta Motokura, the producer for Donkey Kong Bonanza. Until now, I've mostly been involved in the development of 3D Mario games, having directed Super Mario 3D World and Super Mario Odyssey. In terms of Donkey Kong games, I worked on the character designs for Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. As the producer for Donkey Kong Bonanza, I crafted the game's concept and set the direction for the overall structure and player controls." Kazuya Takahashi, referred to as Takahashi from this point on, says, "Hello, I'm Kazuya Takahashi, one of the directors for this game. I joined Nintendo in 2020, but before that, I worked on a broad spectrum of games, including open-world RPGs and arcade games. For this game, I gave directions on the game design and worked on the level design, cutscenes, and text creation." Wataru Tanaka, referred to as Tanaka from this point on, says, "Hello, I'm Wataru Tanaka, another of the game's directors. I've been involved in the development of several 3D Mario games since Super Mario Galaxy 2. From Super Mario Odyssey, I implemented player controls and directed the core system of action elements. As the programming director for Donkey Kong Bonanza, I mostly provided direction on the processing performance and utilization of system functions for Nintendo Switch 2, as well as enemy behavior." Daisuke Watanabe, again referred to as Watanabe from this point on, says, "Hello, I'm Daisuke Watanabe, the art director. I was in charge of character design in the Super Mario Galaxy series and joined Super Mario 3D World as the design lead. I oversaw Donkey Kong Bonanza's overall art direction." Naoto Kubo says, "Hi, I'm Naoto Kubo, the sound director. I've previously composed music for Super Mario Maker and led the overall sound development for Super Mario Odyssey. As the sound director for Donkey Kong Bonanza, I coordinated overall sound development and controlled quality. I also composed some of the game's music myself." End quote. It's interesting that Kazuya Takahashi mentioned specifically cut-scene creation, as while obviously directors have a broad area of influence, this is a particular field where I can see a former Square employee could add a lot of knowledge from their past experience, and that knowledge would be not found to the same degree in Nintendo's own body of developers. Also, I feel like Kubo has a particularly big task here to compete with David Wise's unbelievably good scores in other Donkey Kong titles. The first response then makes clear almost exactly what we always thought the motivation was for the inspiration for the new Donkey Kong game. Motokura starts, "Development began when Koizumi-san approached our team and said, 'With an eye to expanding the Donkey Kong franchise further, I'd like the team that's been working on 3D Mario games to create a 3D Donkey Kong game. The Donkey Kong series started with an arcade game created by Miyamoto-san. It featured a lot of things that were innovative for arcade games at the time, such as narrative-based gameplay and stage composition with varied designs. Later on, we had success with the Donkey Kong Country series developed with Rare Limited, and I think those titles also represented a significant innovation as Super NES games with unique visuals. So this time around, tasked with developing a Donkey Kong game ourselves, we decided we were going to aim for another big innovation. We'd built up a lot of expertise in gameplay development for 3D action games through our work on 3D Mario games, including Super Mario Odyssey, but we needed to dive deeper into the fundamental question of what is Donkey Kong? So our first step was to seek out Miyamoto-san and Koizumi-san." End quote. This is a relatively unusual move and makes me question the degree of strategic direction that we've seen recently from Nintendo. Of course, Miyamoto has always deployed teams to particular franchises, and reportedly Donkey Kong Country going to Retro Studios in the first place was inspired in a similar way, so it isn't new for teams to be assigned new IPs to work on. Nor is it unusual for even this top team to be given rather vague instructions. Super Mario Galaxy started with Miyamoto's wish to make a spherical platformer without necessarily any clarity of what that would entail. Still, most of the time when teams shift tracks, it's because of a pitch internally, like ARMS or Splatoon, though, as is covered later in the interview, such a title was clearly starting to emerge, and it's difficult to fully disaggregate the thought process as Nintendo don't need to be fully upfront about their reasons for developing this particular game at this particular time. Still, it might have felt plausible that they came up with the voxel mechanic and then thought, Donkey Kong can use this. But in this case, it seems like there is clearly a strategic aim to rehabilitate Donkey Kong, and now that we have more movie leaks, it's pretty clear as to why this has become more of a priority. It should also be noted that they are referencing the Odyssey team. It's possible, of course, and I've not really discussed the possibility as much, that the next Mario game is the one from a new team, and there is good precedent here with Super Mario Sunshine's team breaking apart when this group originally moved to Tokyo after dabbling with the smaller Jungle Beat, started then working on the game that became Super Mario Galaxy. Could it be that just like then, a new team is going to be heading up Mario? Yes, drawing on all the expertise from Mario developers past, but fundamentally charting a new course. Well, it's not impossible, I think, to believe that a new Mario grouping could emerge in the same way. And this next part of Motokura's quote focuses on the development of Donkey Kong Bonanza. He says, "Miyamoto-san, who was also involved in the development of the Donkey Kong games created by Rare Limited and Retro Studios Inc., put great emphasis on Donkey Kong's moves, such as hand slaps and blowing on things. Hearing that made me realize the wide range of moves Donkey Kong has at his disposal, and that there's potential to expand them even further. Koizumi-san, who is involved in both Super Mario Odyssey and Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, highlighted Donkey Kong's massive arms as something that sets him apart from Mario. I felt that Koizumi-san put emphasis on Donkey Kong's strength, like delivering mighty punches or lifting heavy objects." End quote. What I find fascinating and significant, although unsurprising perhaps, is that nowhere in here is mentioned anything like Donkey Kong's look, his unique cast of characters, the incredible and iconic music, the atmosphere, specific gameplay mechanics, or anything else. The hand slaps, his strength, reaching and blowing on things are barely even gameplay mechanics for the most part, but more functions of his unique proportions and designs, and what such a character permits the player to be able to do. In the past, Nintendo has sometimes had characters be fairly generic in terms of their movesets. See the Super Mario Bros. Series, for example, of where there are many selectable characters, but they all play broadly similarly. However, with Donkey Kong as the lead character in his own game, they don't just want him as an icon, but they want his unique characteristics to be expressed in play, even if these haven't always been fully integrated before. The next question then asks, "I have the impression that the Donkey Kong series brings something new to the table with each installment. Where does this title fit in?" Modokoro replies, Well now, in a long-running series, novelty and continuity are both important, but we wanted this title to fully convey the appeal of Donkey Kong as a character. Meanwhile, we thought that by creating something new, leveraging our experience developing 3D Mario games, we'd have the opportunity to create two separate branches, 2D Donkey Kong and 3D Donkey Kong, just as we did with Mario games. So, keeping in mind that this game will come to symbolize 3D Donkey Kong, and with the theme of bringing Donkey Kong's strengths and new actions to the forefront, we thought the concept of destruction would be a good fit. End quote. This effectively serves as a confirmation that 2D Donkey Kong will continue, which isn't a surprise exactly, but still isn't always a sure thing. Of course, it's also not a surprise that the franchise they literally built a theme park attraction around would continue, but I think the explicit mention here of the 2D branch being separate probably reflects an internal confidence that 2D DK will be back sooner or later, rather than just an oblique reference to the already forgotten Donkey Kong Country Returns HD a few months ago, which could potentially have held the line for Donkey Kong for another many years to come. Watanabe also discusses the nature of the makeover of the character. He says, "That was a hot topic of discussion. People's impressions of Donkey Kong actually vary quite significantly from person to person. Donkey Kong began life in the arcades as Mario's nemesis, but since then he's had many guises depending on the game, be that as a cool, rugged king of the jungle or a lovable goofball. So rather than just giving him a simple design update, we strove for a design that would get to the core of what makes Donkey Kong who he is, bringing out his unique characteristics and appeal." Modukura adds, "We also interview people who've drawn illustrations of Donkey Kong from way back to preserve the image of Donkey Kong in the mind of his creator, Miyamoto-san." Watanabe continues, "We got no shortage of advice, from general guidance regarding his body frame and unique facial expressions, right down to the smallest detail, like how his pointy hairdo is essential, but you can't make it too long." Modokura says, "Because the series has been played for such a long time, we pursued the identity of Donkey Kong himself in various aspects." Watanabe continues, "Also, as we were testing out various moves with a temporary character model in the early phases of development, it became apparent how much bigger Donkey Kong is than Mario, giving him a considerable on-screen presence. This meant we could properly showcase a wide range of facial expressions, and by combining them with powerful moves, we felt we could create something new in terms of game feel too." Motokura continues, "When controlling a character in a 3D world, the player often sees them from behind, so we were also conscious of how Donkey Kong would look from the back while he's moving. The back view of Donkey Kong just looks like a massive brown fur, which would make for a monotonous visual if we simply rendered him in 3D. That inspired us to make some creative adjustments to his outfit, such as giving him breeches and suspenders. We also made his fur look rich and thick. Outside of this game, Donkey Kong has recently appeared in the Super Mario Bros. Movie, released in 2023, and in Mario Kart World, but there's a basic character design which provided the foundation for those versions of Donkey Kong. That basic Donkey Kong design has been completely revamped. While overhauling the designs, we returned to where it had been when it all started. We took Miyamoto-san's original Donkey Kong as the basis, adding design elements from Donkey Kong Bananza here and there." End quote. This has broadly been covered in the previous interviews, but it's interesting to see some specifics about how the logistics of the viewing angle and such like affected the design choices for the character. Also, while we've looked at the expressiveness of Donkey Kong as being a design choice linked to the capabilities of the Switch 2 and the need for the character to be a more prominent franchise icon, this quote suggests that it was as much a function of the size of the character, permitting those more detailed expressions to be shown. I wonder whether this facility of Donkey Kong, by comparison with Mario, to showcase a wide range of emotions will lead to a clearer differentiation in the kind of character work and narrative focus we will see in future for Mario as opposed to Donkey Kong. Given that Yoshiaki Koizumi is on the board of Nintendo Pictures, I've long expected the next 3D Mario to focus on these kinds of elements, but perhaps Donkey Kong is the better vehicle for this kind of content, and we may have more insights into this from the credits, which I will deep dive in due course. The interviewer concludes, does that mean that all of the recent Donkey Kong designs, including those from the movie and Mario Kart World, have their roots in the original one created by Miyamoto-san, with elements of Donkey Kong from Donkey Kong Bonanza added to it? And Motokoro replies, that's correct. Donkey Kong Bonanza sparked the creation of a design which I think better conveys the new Donkey Kong. His thick fur stands out compared to the previous design, making him look wilder, and yet at first glance, his various facial expressions also give him the impression that he's a comical and charming character. That said, I saw he can alter his appearance in this game by transforming. Takahashi explains, smashing lots of terrain and collecting gold fills up the banana gauge, allowing Donkey Kong to perform Bananza transformations in which he powers up by transforming to different animals. This idea emerged while we were searching for Donkey Kong's ability change. We were discussing how it might be fun if, once he transforms into a powerful Kong Bonanza, he could deal out destruction in different ways, not just with regular punches, but with charge punches, piercing punches, and the like. In Mario's case, he progresses through the game by powering up and becoming bigger or using special abilities, but in this game, Donkey Kong can transform anywhere by harnessing the power of Bonanza transformation. Being able to transform anywhere lets him chain together his destruction, which is the concept of this game. We thought that this chain of destruction would be compelling as an action game, and so it became one of the key gameplay elements we focused on in this title. End quote. The chain of destruction seems to be the key theme that they are emphasizing here, and I like that the key mechanic here isn't just isolated destruction, but how they link together into a sequence of activities. This links in a way to the way Tears of the Kingdom allowed you to fuse together different items in what they called multiplicative gameplay, i.e. a small number of movesets can be combined to create vast possibilities. In this next section, though, we'll get into the weeds of the origin of this game. Tanaka then confirms, actually the programming team had already been researching smashing mechanics even before development began. No, shortly after Super Mario Odyssey was released, we started running technical experiments with the idea of what kind of game do you get if everything in the environment is destructible. Motokoro explains, we even tried sticking arms on a Goomba. Tanaka says that's right, we did. In Super Mario Odyssey, there's a boss called Knuckletech who attacks Mario with giant hands. The programmer who created him tried attaching those arms to a Goomba as an experiment. The Goomba could smash terrain, tear off pieces to use as weapons, and throw them. These actions felt surprisingly satisfying, and we got a sense that this destruction-based gameplay could be a compelling core mechanic. Motokoro adds, the results of our tests showed that destruction-based gameplay could work, and it was a good match for Donkey Kong's enormous strength. We felt that the concept and the core gameplay had clicked into place, but truth be told, that was just the first step in a long journey. We did a ton of testing. We wanted to incorporate actions like tearing off parts of the terrain and swinging it, resulting in further destruction, like smashing something to reveal a new path. At the core, we wanted to create a game where the player's actions trigger reactions, and that continuous interaction keeps moving the gameplay forward. End quote. Now, they date the beginning of these smashing mechanics, where they clearly had a number of different models in play, and yet Donkey Kong seemingly wasn't considered as a vehicle for this mechanic at first, or at least not as the primary exponent of it. Nor, contrary to some speculation I've seen, it appears to be the case that Bowser was the key character in this development concept, although it might be that if they did have this in mind for Bowser, they would save this information for the development of a potential Bowser title. Of course, it might be that they did have Bowser as someone they thought could be the primary exponent of this game. Maybe Donkey Kong was in there as well, but they thought they would experiment with lots of different options, including, of course, that Goomba with Knuckletech's arms. Although it may seem obvious in hindsight that this mechanic is a perfect fit for Donkey Kong, I don't necessarily think these mechanics were always inevitably going to lead to a fully developed game. A title like Super Mario Odyssey, with its panoply of transformations, is full of different mechanics, and even voxel technology seemingly was used in places there. It seems to me that the team will have had multiple different experiments at any one point going on, and then they can see what can be done with them and whether this is in the form of a full game or whether just part of a broader title. That will depend on the strength of the concepts that they see. It's not necessarily the case that every vehicle for different gameplay will become enough to become the spine of a game in its own right. Although personally, I would love to see the Super Mario Odyssey Gusher mechanics at the centre of a new Mario Sunshine title, as I really feel they perfected a lot of what Super Mario Sunshine had already started. Okay, let's now get into the voxels. Tanaka explains, we decided pretty early on that if we were serious about pursuing that kind of gameplay, we should use voxel technology. And the questioner asks, voxel technology, what exactly is that? So Tanaka explains, let's start with pixel art, which I think most people are familiar with. Pixel art is made up of lots of tiny squares arranged on a flat surface, and by varying the colours of those squares, they combine to form a single image. While each square is a two-dimensional image called a pixel, when the same idea is expanded into 3 dimensions, each cube is called a voxel. It's hard to put into words, so we created this diagram to clearly explain it to the development team, since it's such an important element in this game. Motakura says, since our team's been creating 3D action games for a long time, we thought that combining what we did in 3D Mario games with voxel-based destruction would naturally lead to a completely new kind of gameplay. Takahashi says, everything in this game is made out of voxels, including the terrain and the enemies, and it's the voxel-based terrain that enables the core gameplay feature where you can destroy virtually everything in sight. Tanaka explains as well, but once we decided to go all in with voxels, I instinctively knew it was going to be difficult. That's because the development environment for voxel-based games was not readily available to everyone on our team. So first, we needed to consider how to go about creating the voxels themselves. Voxels are really just part of the internal structure, so we focused on making sure players wouldn't notice them while playing. The biggest reason we chose voxels was their flexibility, as they let us define the appearance and material of each part of the terrain individually. It's not just that the terrain is destructible, it also has various different properties. Take sand, for example. It's soft, sticks to walls and when thrown, and is hard to climb because you tend to slip. There are also visual differences, such as desert sand being yellowish and shoreside sand being whiter in colour. The development team collectively referred to different substances, such as white sand, red soil, and grey rock, as materials. Each has its own unique physical properties and appearance. Each voxel in the game is assigned one of those materials. Watanabe explains, put simply, placing voxels with the soil material generates terrain made of soil. Adding voxels with the grass material on top of that then turns it into terrain with grass growing over soil. Terrain created in this way can be destroyed on a voxel by voxel basis. Takahashi says, typically in a game development, 3D levels are created by first building polygon models and then applying textures to each one of them. But for this game, as soon as we had our voxel modeling tools, things became much more convenient. We could freely combine voxels and materials to build terrain and then test it out immediately in-game. This let us quickly experiment and iterate when building layers. That's one of the great things about voxel technology, I think, though it must have been an absolute nightmare for the programmers building the tools. Thanks to the creation of this toolset, we were able to craft layers that feel truly unique to this game, with terrain that features a rich variety of visual styles and physical properties, along with underground areas and fully destructible environments down to the smallest details. Motokura also confirms, actually, we also use voxel technology in Super Mario Odyssey to make the terrain interactive. For example, the cheese rocks in Luncheon Kingdom or the snow you can plow through in Snow Kingdom. That said, in Super Mario Odyssey, we started using voxels midway through development, so the areas where we could apply them were limited. But the trial and error we went through back then directly led to what we were able to do in Donkey Kong Bonanza. End quotes. Next, we have an interesting confirmation about the date of the beginning of development, with Motokoro confirming, "We originally began developing Donkey Kong Bonanza on Nintendo Switch, but we ran into some challenges. I think it was around 2021 when we started to think about moving development to Switch 2. End quote. With Breath of the Wild, we did have confirmation that there was an explicit instruction to redevelop this game as the Switch launch title, even though it had been previously targeting Wii U. But in this case, it seems like there was a decision a lot earlier to move the Bonanza development over. This could make sense of why there was no Donkey Kong game on the Switch between 2018's Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze and 2025's Donkey Kong Country Returns, and perhaps indeed explains why Donkey Kong Country Returns was commissioned in the first place, as a stopgap game was required, given that there wouldn't be a new Donkey Kong on the original Switch. Watanabe continues, "We first looked into how we could upgrade what we'd originally built for Switch to take advantage of Switch 2. One of the most obvious improvements was that we could place far more objects in the environment than before. Being able to place more objects in the terrain didn't just enhance the game's visual richness. More importantly, it increased the amount of things players could destroy, which amplified the exhilaration of being able to demolish anything and everything. That went hand in hand with the game's core concept of destruction. It convinced us that this game would be even more fun if we developed it for Switch 2. Tanaka says, "From a programmer's perspective, Voxel technology is well suited for creating gameplay centered around destruction. However, it also uses a lot of system memory, and we face the challenge of Switch not having enough to support everything we wanted to do. I'll explain with some simple arithmetic. If you're asked to double the size of a 1x1 pixel image in both width and height, you end up with a 2x2 image, which means 4 times as many pixels. But when you do the same with voxels, you've got width and height, but also depth to contend with. So doubling all 3 dimensions gives you 2 times 2 times 2, or 8 times the data. It may sound simple to just double something, but the reality is that memory usage, voxel density, and all kinds of processes end up gobbling up 8 times the resources. It was clear that the memory available on Switch would struggle to handle that load, and we felt that manifesting the huge volume of terrain that we did in this game might have been unachievable on that platform. With the move to Switch 2, we gained not only more memory but also greater processing capability. That gave us the freedom to incorporate gameplay ideas we'd previously abandoned because they were too demanding. When we got down to trying it, we discovered that not only could it handle the heavy processing requirements, but it also ran at 60 frames per second. Things we'd given up on, like explosions flinging large objects or causing them to collapse, were now possible. Designers could also place as many objects as they wanted. There were so many moments when we thought to ourselves, now we can really do this. Watanabe explains, as well as running at a smooth 60 frames per second, the core gameplay of smashing got way more satisfying. The physics of smashing involve lots of things all happening at once. Donkey Kong throws a punch, the terrain and objects break apart, and visual effects show debris flying outwards. All of that is packed into a single moment. At 30 frames per second, we couldn't fully capture everything that happens in that instant, but at 60 frames per second, we saw that sense of destruction coming through much more clearly. We thought to ourselves, now we've got something seriously satisfying. Not only did Switch 2 enable the game to run well, it unlocked the game's full potential. No, it made the game possible. Watanabe says, "We talked about voxel technology earlier, and I think for most people the term voxel game brings to mind visuals made of stacked cubes. That's exactly why we as designers aim to create rich and dense visuals that don't look like voxels at all, something that players will see and think, wait, you can really destroy this? We believed that by creating dense visuals with a sense of realism that weren't obviously made of voxels, players would be genuinely surprised when they realised that the environment was destructible. That surprise would make the sense of destruction all the more convincing and satisfying. This wasn't something the designers could handle on their own. We worked closely with the programmers, running test after test to figure things out together. Since voxel technology has yet to be fully explored, we had to figure things out as we went along, experimenting with both the mechanics and the design." Tanaka says, "The technology that enables voxel-based shapes to appear smooth already existed, but we figured that if we were going to do it right, we should push the visuals to have a strong sense of realism. End quotes. Not much to add to this section, but I'm reminded a lot of the way the original GameCube had multiple ways to show games using different graphical capabilities besides increased realism or that were unique to the GameCube. The lighting in Luigi's Mansion, the number of characters on screen at once in Pikmin, and the water effect in Super Mario Sunshine, to say nothing of Wind Waker's groundbreaking cel-shaded style artwork. Now I wonder what new techniques the Switch 2 will open up if they have spent the last decade focusing on finding unique twists on broadly consistent but juicier technology. Watanabe continues. Since destruction is such a central concept in the game, we had to pay attention not just to how things looked, but also to the physical properties of the terrain itself. We focused not just on the surface of the terrain, but also what lies beneath it once it breaks. We designed the terrain so that when it's destroyed or carved out, its appearance and physical properties change in ways that make the sense of destruction feel more convincing. Tanaka explains, for example, if you strip away the grass, it exposes the soil underneath. If you strike a rock, cracks begin to form, and if you dig near water, the ground gradually darkens as moisture seeps in. We carefully define the effects each material produces when it breaks, refining every detail to make the destruction feel as realistic and convincing as possible. Kubo says, we also poured a lot of effort into the sound effects to make the sense of destruction feel satisfying and responsive. It wasn't just about using loud or dramatic sounds. For instance, players will hear the sound of basic materials like rocks breaking thousands of times during play, so we aimed for sounds that are pleasant to the ears without being tiring or repetitive. To that end, we recorded sound effects by hand, capturing the textures of materials like rock and sand. Recording everyday sounds like this is often referred to as Foley. We recorded lots of variations so the sound would vary depending on how the material was destroyed, instead of always sounding the same. We also added subtle randomness through programming and fine-tuned the sounds to make sure they weren't too loud or high-pitched. Meanwhile, for special objects that show up later in the game, we emphasized fun and flashy sounds. We hope players will find them satisfying. We recorded all kinds of material sounds using Foley techniques, including those of fruits. There's even a dedicated sound for hitting a watermelon. It was about more than just making it sound hard or soft. When players hit it, we wanted it to sound delicious. Modokura says, we put a lot of thought into the sound and visual effects, and into making the destruction feel satisfying. I think players will realize the fun of smashing things the moment they start playing. It's a simple, intuitive kind of fun that even newcomers to action games will appreciate. Compared to Super Mario Odyssey, I think the game's core appeal and sense of exhilaration can be felt more immediately. Takahashi says, this game isn't just about smashing things. Continuity is another important concept we focused on. For example, there's a move called the hand slap, where Donkey Kong slams the ground. That move also acts like a sonar, revealing objects buried nearby. You might spot something glowing on the other side of a wall, and when you break through the wall and dig up the fossil buried there, you might then come upon a hidden area beyond that, leading to even more discoveries. End quote. I particularly like hearing the element of randomness built in. This is an effective way to just make everything feel a bit more surprising and varied to me. I also love the way the hand slap is now sonar, mixing the physical presence of Donkey Kong as requested by Miyamoto and Koizumi with pragmatic game design needs. Takahashi continues, when creating layers, we went beyond surface level design. We crafted them with continuity in mind, so that breaking one thing would naturally lead to the next, and that's exactly why they needed so much thought put into them. The layers are fun, even if you just play through them normally, but we designed them so that even if the destruction causes their structure to collapse, it's all part of the fun. In most games, level design is a bit like designing a course. You've got a main route you want the players to follow, and you build paths to guide them along it. But in this game, even those paths can be destroyed. For example, the correct way to get a golden banana, aka Banandium gem, might be to use the Bananza transformations to smash through a concrete wall. But if you instead dig a tunnel and sneak around to grab it from behind, that is equally viable. Designing levels with that kind of flexibility in mind was a huge challenge, but I think the ability to be crafty like that is part of what makes this game so fun. Kubo says it must have been tough, though, designing all those hidden underground areas, and Watanabe says the levels in this game are really expansive, both vertically and horizontally, so he talked about how he could ensure players wouldn't get lost. Madokura says in the 3D Mario games, the goal is often placed high up, but since digging and breaking things are the main actions in this game, the player naturally moves downward instead. We kept tweaking the design using various mechanisms and the terrain to gently guide the player, balancing the exhilaration of destroying everything with the satisfaction you get when you complete a layer. End quotes. Now, I'd only add to all this that it feels very reminiscent of the design philosophy that inspired The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Despite both being EPD teams, the EPD3 group responsible for Zelda and the EPD8 team here are very different, based in different cities even. I don't even know if there's much pooling of ideas in that sense, but clearly the Nintendo philosophy is ingrained in both groups, and that approach that is almost more like building a toy than a traditional game seems to underpin the perspective of both titles. Also on the layers, Takahashi says, we started by giving each layer its own theme. Then we came up with unique gameplay ideas using voxels. We also considered the materials we talked about earlier. We asked ourselves questions like, what if there was a layer made of ice or lava? And since it's possible to ride chunks of stone you've torn off like a skateboard, we thought it would be fun to create a layer with rolling hills that would really entice you to do that. For each of these layers, we started by thinking about the kind of gameplay we wanted to create. Watanabe explains, we wanted players to experience a sense of surprise each time they reached a new layer. So while figuring out the gameplay, we also thought about each area's color scheme, unique features, and so on. We made sure each layer felt distinct and looked at the world's overall balance to develop the concept art. Madokura says, in Miyamoto-san's mind, Donkey Kong's world always felt like New York City. When we asked him early on, what is Donkey Kong? He explained that the steel beams and ladders in the original Donkey Kong game were inspired by the neon lights of New York City. Even the star in the O of the logo was inspired by the American aesthetic. Watanabe says, our goal was to make sure the underground world feel like an entirely separate civilization to that of the surface and to cram it full of variety. We felt compelled to create a fresh new world for Donkey Kong, so instead of sticking to what past games in the series had done, we made sure each layer had its own unique world and flavour. That said, we did draw inspiration from Miyamoto-san's original vision of Donkey Kong. By weaving neon colours into the visuals as key elements, we aimed to create something fresh while still evoking the feel of the original arcade game. By the way, the pink and light blue neon tones were inspired by the colours of the ladders and steel beams in the original game. Kubo adds, we also composed music that adds to this experience. When a player reaches a new layer, the music helps to draw them in and sets the tone for the world they've just entered. This game is all about destruction, but since players can spend long periods of time exploring the same layer, having only fast-paced music that relentlessly pushes them to take action would end up being exhausting. To strike the right balance, we used percussion to inject some groove, but made sure the music also adds to each layer's unique atmosphere. End quote. I will be particularly fascinated to see, as I get to play more of the game, exactly how all of this works with the music, as I feel like this could foreshadow a different approach to Zelda than the Wild games. The Wild games did not have a great deal of content within them in terms of living characters because it was effectively a post-apocalyptic world, but a more mainline period or representation of Hyrule might include a more dramatic and stirring set of music, and I'd be interested to see how that could be managed without feeling overbearing. It's also curious to me that while Donkey Kong Country is referenced, the arcade game retains a great pull, and small wonder given its huge success, legendary status, and the fact that it is Japanese developed. I also didn't know before that the star was a reference to the American origins of the inspiration of that game. Kubo then responds to the question, I got the chance to browse through some of the development materials. It looks like you really mapped out how the mood and intensity of the music shift throughout the game. And he says, in response, a comment that yet again mentions story, something relatively unusual in an EPD8 game, certainly since Super Mario Galaxy, which of course led to some friction between Koizumi and Miyamoto due to the heavy story elements. He says of the mood and intensity of the music. That's right. The way the story's tension builds and the liveliness of each layer really impacts the sense of enjoyment, so we carefully considered the overall musical balance. We might build up excitement in one layer, then shift to something more serious and dreamlike in the next. That wide range of musical expressions may be one of the game's defining characteristics. In past Donkey Kong games too, although the music was mostly built around a cheerful jungle vibe, it also featured tracks that were deeply enchanting or mysterious. I think that sense of musical variety is something we've carried over into this game. The series has a lot of recognisable background music though, so of course Donkey Kong Bonanza has arrangements of those sprinkled throughout too. However, it's also a completely new Donkey Kong game, so we momentarily set aside the fact that it's part of a series and took up the challenge of composing new tracks from scratch. At the same time, Donkey Kong's new transformation mechanic was added, which meant we had to create tracks that would play while he's in his transformed state. That's when one of the designers came up with this sketch of a zebra as one of his transformations, and they declared Donkey Kong will transform into this. The mere sight of this sketch was enough to shock me, but actually, seeing it programmed into action, I thought to myself, well, since we've gone this far, we might as well also transform the music that plays once Donkey Kong has transformed. Changing the music that plays is actually quite a big deal. Even in Mario games, we don't go that far unless it's a major transformation, like getting a superstar and turning invincible. But since Donkey Kong only transforms for a limited time, and it has such a big impact on the gameplay, we decided to go all out with transforming the music. We envisioned a track that would give you the urge to sprint as soon as you heard it, and then the image of a zebra galloping passionately to Latin or Spanish style music popped into my head. I mean, not that Latin music has anything to do with zebras, but still. Just as we were thinking, oh, that transitioned quite nicely, this might be rather interesting, Motokura-san comes along and says, Tanaka adds, so that was when it happened. Motokura says, right. I said, maybe we can add Pauline. Motokura explains, originally we were discussing whether to have Pauline in the game as a character that players could relate to, but at that time we weren't able to incorporate Pauline into a gameplay feature unique to this title. However, now that the transformation mechanic had started to take shape, we thought we could create something new by tying Pauline's singing to the Bananza transformations. So I asked Kubo-san, would you care to write an animal song for Pauline to sing? Kubo says not just one, he requested one for each and every Bananza transformation. But I thought I might as well go full swing, so I added vocals to the Latin and Spanish style music. Even though it was the same bass track, the response I got from the team was completely different, much more positive. It made a strong impression on me that really cemented my sense of how powerful the human voice is. Modokura says, when I made that request, Kubo-san, I wasn't leaving until I'd heard a yes from you. We had the same situation for Super Mario Odyssey, didn't we? End quotes. Now Modokura here is clearly showing that he's ascending the Nintendo pantheon and perhaps has left behind his days of directing and has moved over to producing. He certainly seems to be at the hub of this team. I think it's also significant here that they are putting a big emphasis on how the music is different through the inclusion of voice, which on the one hand is an obvious differentiating factor given the character of Pauline, but also does help them to put a bit of distance between what they're doing here and what David Wise was doing in the Donkey Kong Country games. Of the timing of Pauline's inclusion, Motokura expands. It was after we'd created the destruction gameplay to a certain extent. In the story, Donkey Kong is motivated by his love of bananas, but we wanted to have something else that players could relate to. By featuring Pauline, we thought we could create an experience where players are part of Pauline's growth and the growth of Donkey Kong, adventuring alongside her. The best part was that it gave us the chance to incorporate various gameplay features using the power of song, such as breaking seals or showing the route to a destination. Takashi adds, because she's a human character, she can take on the role of explaining things, and since she opens up about her feelings when she visits the underground world for the first time, players can empathize with her, giving them the feeling that they're with her on the adventure. Watanabe says, I think the story is also entertaining and Pauline's presence played a big role in that. If Donkey Kong were on his own, we could never have included as many talking scenes. Takashi says, Donkey Kong and his friends, as well as their enemies, the Void Company minions, are all headed for the planet core in the hopes of having their wishes granted. Although they all have the same goal of heading underground, their motivations differ. Donkey Kong is just out for bananas. Pauline wants to return home to the surface, while the Void Company seeks to hog the well for themselves. I think the fact that their enemies are also Kongs is another thing that distinguishes Donkey Kong Bonanza. End quotes. Now, a quick thought here. I do wonder to what extent the Void Company will become a part of Donkey Kong's future going forward. It seems to me that while Mario suits films, the family nature of Donkey Kong would lend itself very well to a television program, but irrespective for serial television storytelling, a significant rogues gallery is a benefit. And Donkey Kong has had many different types of villains over the years, and indeed the ones from the Donkey Kong Returns game are actually a part of the current theme park. But still, it seems like there is more scope for more iconic Donkey Kong antagonists, as well, of course, as King K. Rool. The team also discuss using two-player via GameShare. Mudokura says, as a side note, if you use GameShare or share your Joy-Con 2 controllers, player 1 controls Donkey Kong, while player 2 controls Pauline. Pauline can attack their enemies with a vocal blasts. Since the game's on Switch 2, players can also use Joy-Con 2 mouse controls when playing as Pauline, so I hope you'll give that a try. Tanaka says you can wreak havoc with her singing voice alone, so I think you can have fun just smashing things. If you keep on destroying things, you'll eventually hit upon treasure chests with maps of Banandium gems and fossils. It's a unique co-op experience, so I hope even those who are new to video games will feel comfortable to give it a try. End quotes. Now, I assume Nintendo have data on how many people use the two-player mode on games like Odyssey and now Donkey Kong Bonanza. I do think one underexplored option that the surfeit of original Switch consoles creates is allowing for people to play local co-op in a sandbox world with people playing on their own Switches with the game cast presumably from the Switch 2. So far, though, multiplayer has been chiefly the preserve of course-based Mario titles, with Cappy being a limited nod to multiplayer, so it will be interesting to see if this is a more satisfying version of that, and if they can continue to find a way to allow what is essentially a one-player game to have a two-player co-op component without requiring separate consoles to play over local wireless. All after this, they give their final messages from the team. So Kubo says, in this game you progress by smashing all kinds of things. Your surroundings change constantly, so we worked hard to create sounds that reflect that change. We measured the sizes of areas such as open spaces and caves and adjusted the volume and reverberation accordingly. Even for the background music, we split each song into multiple tracks and adjusted the balance according to Donkey Kong's surroundings and the size of the area. I think it's an audio experience unique to games that use voxel technology, so I hope players will listen out for those details too as they play. Watanabe says, I think Donkey Kong is fun to play in this game with his rich facial expressions and exciting moves. I'd love for players to experience it for themselves. Also, the underground world where this game takes place is a bit different from previous games in the series. It's a beautiful yet strange world, and I hope players will enjoy it to the fullest as they journey together with Donkey Kong and his friends. Oh, and smash everything in their paths, naturally. Tanaka says, I think the gameplay mechanic that lets you destroy everything, right down to enemies and non-player characters, stands out as being unique to Donkey Kong Bonanza. Not only are things destructible, but the presence of materials expands the gameplay experience even further, with some things being hard and impossible to break with his bare hands or thorny, etc. It would be great if players were also on the lookout for actions based on materials, like tearing off part of an enemy that's made of explosives and using it to destroy other stuff. Takahashi says there's a lot of leeway in terms of progression in this game. For example, locations or parts of the stories you can skip without suffering any consequences. When the game progresses in a way we hadn't intended, we call it a sequence break in development terminology. Typically, in game development, restrictions are put in place to prevent this from happening. But since this game is all about destruction, we wanted people to play freely. Truth be told, restrictions make things a lot easier for us developers. But please do experiment. Modokura says, I think the strength of video games in general is the player's ability to spark interactions. In previous 3D Mario games too, we created gameplay based on those kinds of interactions, but I think we were able to take that to a whole new level in Donkey Kong Bonanza. We devoted ourselves to creating a game that feels instinctive to play no matter how many times you played it. We developed this title with great care and an awareness that Nintendo wouldn't be where it is today if not for the original Donkey Kong game. As well as building on the series so far, Donkey Kong as a character continues to explore the unknown in movies, theme parks, and other new experiences. We took on a bunch of new challenges with Donkey Kong Bonanza, and it's shaped up to be a game that we're proud to present to the world. So please do give it a try. We'll strive to keep on delivering a Donkey Kong game that's fun for everyone. End quotes. And I don't have much more to say to this except that I am very much looking forward to getting into it. Thank you so much for listening as ever, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.